The room went silent when the waitress corrected the billionaire's lawyer. Nobody expected what happened next. The mistake was small. Just 12 words buried deep inside a contract worth billions of dollars. But before the night was over, those 12 words would change everything. The Grand Lexington Hotel stood above downtown Chicago like a monument to success. Its glass exterior reflected the evening skyline, while luxury sedans lined the entrance below. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated a private conference ballroom reserved for one of the largest corporate merger negotiations of the year. Executives from multiple states had flown in. Attorneys filled entire tables with legal documents. Financial advisors checked projections on tablets and laptops. Every person in the room understood the stakes. If the agreement succeeded, it would create one of the largest logistics companies in North America. If it failed, years of planning could disappear overnight. At the center of the room sat Ethan Montgomery, 42 years old, billionaire, founder and chief executive officer of Montgomery Holdings. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of employees and billions of dollars. When Ethan spoke, people listened. When Ethan disagreed, people adjusted their opinions quickly. Success had rewarded his instincts so often that he rarely questioned them anymore. Around him, lawyers reviewed revisions while assistants delivered updated documents between tables. The atmosphere felt intense but controlled. Every conversation revolved around numbers, liabilities, ownership percentages, and legal language. No one paid attention to the waitstaff moving quietly around the room, especially not to Nia Richardson. Dressed in a black service uniform with a white button-down shirt, Nia moved between tables carrying coffee and bottled water. She blended into the background so naturally that most executives never looked directly at her face. They noticed the tray, the coffee, the service, not the person. Nia had become accustomed to that. Working at luxury events taught her an important lesson. The more powerful the room, the less people noticed those serving them. Near midnight, the lead attorney paused while reviewing a revised section of the merger agreement. He frowned and adjusted his glasses. Another lawyer leaned over to examine the same paragraph. Soon several attorneys were discussing a specific clause buried within the document. The conversation grew increasingly tense. Ethan listened impatiently. He wanted the deal completed before morning. Every delay irritated him. As the lawyers debated, Nia approached quietly and placed a fresh cup of coffee beside one of the legal advisors. She glanced briefly at the open contract while setting down the cup. Just a moment, barely a second. Then she continued walking. The discussion intensified. One attorney insisted a specific provision had been modified incorrectly. Another claimed the wording remained unchanged. Frustration spread around the table. Ethan finally leaned forward. "How can nobody tell me what the original language said?" he asked sharply. The room fell quiet. Several attorneys shuffled through printed pages searching for answers. Then a voice spoke from nearby. Calm, respectful, unexpected. The original version used different wording in subsection 14. Every head turned. Nia stood beside a serving cart holding an empty coffee pot. For a moment nobody reacted. Then Ethan blinked and stared at her. A few executives exchanged confused looks. One attorney laughed softly, assuming she was joking. Ethan leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Trust me," he said, glancing toward her. "You could not possibly understand this contract." A few people chuckled politely. The conversation should have ended there. But Nia did not look embarrassed. She did not argue. She simply stood there, calm and composed, as if she already knew something the entire room had yet to discover. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The attorneys looked at Nia Richardson as though she had accidentally wandered into the wrong room. Ethan Montgomery's smile remained in place, but the amusement behind it grew stronger. To him, the situation seemed obvious. A waitress had overheard a complex legal discussion and mistaken confidence for understanding. It happened more often than people realized. The difference was that most people backed away once they were challenged. Nia did not. She simply stood beside the serving cart, calm and composed, while dozens of executives watched her. The ballroom's golden lighting reflected across polished conference tables covered with legal binders, printed contracts, and half-finished cups of coffee. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline glittered against the night sky. Inside, however, all attention had shifted toward a woman most people had ignored for the last 6 hours. One of the attorneys finally broke the silence. "You said subsection 14 used different wording?" he asked cautiously. Nia nodded. "Yes." A few people exchanged skeptical glances. Ethan folded his arms. "Interesting," he said. "And what exactly did it say?" The question carried enough confidence to make several people smile. They expected the conversation to end quickly. Nia lowered her eyes for a moment as if searching through a memory. Then she spoke. The original version stated that any transfer of operational authority required written approval from all controlling partners no less than 30 business days before implementation. The room became noticeably quieter. One attorney looked down at his notes. Another opened a laptop. A third reached for an earlier draft. Nobody spoke while they searched. After several seconds, the attorney nearest the screen frowned. "That is." He stopped, then looked again. "That is actually correct." The comment drew immediate attention. Ethan's expression changed slightly. Not concern. Not yet. Curiosity. Nia remained silent. She did not look pleased with herself. She did not appear eager to impress anyone. The answer seemed entirely ordinary to her. Across the table, another attorney adjusted his glasses. Perhaps she overheard that section earlier. Several heads nodded. It sounded reasonable. Ethan relaxed slightly. That would make sense. Nia offered no argument. She simply picked up the coffee pot and began refilling cups as if the discussion no longer concerned her. Yet something about her behavior continued to bother Ethan. People who guessed correctly usually enjoyed the attention afterward. Nia appeared uninterested in it. The lead attorney flipped through another stack of documents. "Wait," he said suddenly. "What about subsection 18? A few executives smiled. Now the test felt real. The section contained pages of complicated language regarding ownership protections and liability allocation. Even experienced professionals sometimes struggled to quote it accurately. Nia paused beside the table. The room watched. She looked toward the contract for less than a second before answering. Then she began reciting, sentence after sentence, clause after clause, dates, percentages, conditions, legal definitions. Her voice remained steady throughout. "No hesitation. No corrections. No uncertainty." One attorney slowly lowered his pen. Another stopped typing. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. By the time Nia finished, nobody in the ballroom was smiling anymore. Because for the first time that evening, a possibility had entered the room that none of them had considered. What if the waitress actually knew exactly what she was talking about? The atmosphere inside the ballroom felt different now. Not louder, not more chaotic, just uncertain. The certainty that had filled the room earlier in the evening had begun to crack. Attorneys who had spent decades studying contracts were no longer focused entirely on the merger. Executives who usually measured people by titles and credentials found themselves staring at a waitress carrying a coffee pot. Nia Richardson seemed unaware of the effect she was having. She moved quietly between tables, refilling cups and collecting empty glasses as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet every conversation now seemed connected to her. Ethan Montgomery watched her carefully. For the first time that evening, he was no longer certain he understood the situation. He had built his career by identifying talent quickly. He prided himself on reading people within minutes. Investors trusted his judgment. Boards respected his instincts. Tonight, however, his instincts were sending conflicting signals. Nia did not behave like someone seeking attention. She did not seem impressed by the executives surrounding her. She did not appear intimidated either. Most people became nervous when questioned by powerful attorneys. Nia answered complex legal language with the same calm expression she used while pouring coffee. That bothered Ethan more than he cared to admit. Across the room, the lead attorney reopened several earlier drafts of the agreement. His fingers moved rapidly through electronic files while another lawyer compared printed copies spread across the conference table. After several minutes of searching, both men exchanged a surprised look. The wording Nia had recited matched perfectly. Not approximately, not generally, perfectly. Every phrase, every condition, every legal reference. One attorney removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. "How many times have you read this contract?" he finally asked. Nia paused beside a table. "Once." Several people laughed automatically. The laughter ended quickly when they realized she was serious. Ethan leaned forward. "Once." Nia nodded. "Earlier this evening." Silence followed. The answer sounded impossible. The contract contained more than 20 pages of dense legal language. Most professionals required repeated reviews just to remember key provisions. Ethan looked toward his legal team. Nobody seemed eager to explain what they were witnessing. The ballroom lights reflected against polished wood surfaces and glass walls, while Chicago's skyline shimmered outside. Midnight had passed, but nobody appeared interested in leaving. Something far more valuable than the merger itself was unfolding in front of them. Nia continued working while questions circulated through the room. One executive wondered whether she had a law degree. Another guessed she might be a former paralegal. Someone suggested she had memorized portions of the document in advance. Each theory sounded less convincing than the last. The truth remained frustratingly simple. Nobody knew who Nia Richardson really was. Ethan realized something uncomfortable. During the 6 hours she had been serving the room, he had never once asked her name. Not because he was rude, because he never imagined it would matter. Now it seemed like the most important unanswered question in the building. As Nia placed a fresh cup of coffee beside his chair, Ethan looked up at her differently than before. Not as a waitress, not as staff, as a mystery. And before the night ended, that mystery was about to become even harder to explain. The questions continued multiplying while the answers remained frustratingly scarce. Every executive in the ballroom wanted to understand how a waitress could quote complex legal language with near-perfect accuracy after reading it only once. Yet Nia Richardson offered very little information about herself. She answered politely when spoken to. She smiled when thanked. Then she returned to work as though the evening remained completely ordinary. That only made people more curious. The merger negotiations resumed, but concentration had become difficult. Attorneys kept glancing toward Nia whenever she crossed the room. Several executives whispered theories to one another. One investor insisted she must have attended law school. Another suggested she possessed some form of professional memory training. Nobody seemed willing to accept the simplest explanation, that her mind worked differently. Ethan Montgomery sat quietly at the head of the table reviewing financial projections, but his attention drifted repeatedly toward the woman carrying coffee between conversations worth billions of dollars. The more he observed her, the more unusual the situation appeared. Nia never listened like someone trying to eavesdrop. She never lingered near important discussions. In fact, she seemed determined not to attract attention. Yet somehow she had become the most discussed person in the building. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, a sudden problem interrupted the negotiations. A senior legal advisor searching for the final signed draft froze in his chair. His expression immediately changed. "Where is the master copy?" he asked. The room went quiet. Several attorneys looked up. "What do you mean?" another lawyer replied. The advisor shuffled through folders spread across the conference table. Then through a leather briefcase beside his chair. Then through a second stack of documents. His concern became visible. The final revised contract is gone. Chairs shifted across the ballroom. Attorneys stood. Assistants began checking binders and conference folders. The atmosphere transformed almost instantly. Earlier curiosity gave way to urgency. The 20-page agreement contained the exact language required to complete the merger. Without it, final verification could not proceed. Backup files existed, but several recent revisions had only been documented on the printed master copy. Ethan rose from his chair. "Tell me someone made a duplicate." No one answered immediately. That silence spoke loudly enough. Minutes passed. Staff searched tables. Lawyers checked conference rooms. Assistants reviewed printers and document stations throughout the hotel floor. Nothing appeared. The missing contract seemed to have vanished. Frustration spread rapidly. One attorney estimated it could take hours to reconstruct every revision. Another warned that a delay might force both companies to postpone final approval. The deal that had consumed months of preparation suddenly appeared vulnerable because of 20 missing pages. Through all of it, Nia remained remarkably calm. She stood near a service station watching the search unfold. Not detached, simply thoughtful. Ethan noticed her expression. Unlike everyone else, she did not appear surprised. She looked as though she were carefully organizing information in her mind. The room continued searching. Voices grew louder. Stress increased. Then Nia quietly set down the tray she was carrying. The simple motion attracted almost no attention. At least not at first. She looked toward the conference table where executives and attorneys were debating solutions. Then she took a slow breath. "I think I can help," she said. The room immediately stopped moving. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. And for the second time that night, the waitress had everyone's attention. Every person in the ballroom seemed to stop breathing at the same time. The attorneys stood motionless beside stacks of documents. Executives paused in the middle of conversations. Even the hotel staff froze where they stood. Nia Richardson remained beside the service station, her hands resting calmly on the edge of the counter. She did not appear nervous. She did not appear excited. She simply looked certain. Ethan Montgomery stared at her from across the conference table. "You can help?" he asked. The question carried equal parts curiosity and disbelief. Nia nodded. "I think I remember the contract." For a moment nobody reacted. Then several people laughed. Not because they wanted to be cruel, because the statement sounded impossible. One attorney shook his head. Another smiled in disbelief. A financial advisor actually looked down at the floor as if searching for hidden cameras. The missing document contained more than 20 pages of dense legal language. Hundreds of clauses, thousands of words, technical definitions, percentages, timelines, liability provisions. No reasonable person expected a waitress to remember all of it. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Earlier in the evening, he would have dismissed the comment immediately. But Nia had already proven herself once. That made the room hesitate. "You were saying you memorized the entire agreement?" one attorney asked. Nia considered the question carefully. "Not intentionally," she replied. "I read it while waiting for a fresh coffee order. I tend to remember things." The simplicity of her answer somehow made it even more difficult to challenge. Across the room, several executives exchanged uncertain glances. The lead attorney folded his arms. "And you believe you can reconstruct it?" Nia looked toward the empty seat where the missing contract had once rested. "Most of it." The room became quiet again. Ethan noticed something important. She was not claiming perfection. She was not bragging. She was not demanding attention. If anything, she seemed reluctant to speak. That restraint gave her words credibility. One of the attorneys pulled out a legal pad. "All right," he said cautiously. "Let us hear the opening section." More laughter drifted through the room. This time it sounded nervous. People were no longer laughing at Nia. They were laughing at the possibility that she might be right. Nia stepped closer to the conference table. Crystal chandeliers reflected softly across the polished wood surface. Outside, Chicago's skyline shimmered against the darkness, while midnight slowly slipped toward morning. Inside, every eye followed her. Nia closed her eyes briefly, not dramatically, simply concentrating. Then she began speaking. The opening paragraph flowed from memory with remarkable precision. Company names, legal identifiers, effective dates, jurisdiction language. She delivered each line calmly, as though reading from a document directly in front of her. The attorney holding the legal pad immediately started writing. Another lawyer opened a backup file containing fragments of earlier drafts. Within seconds, expressions began changing. Nia continued, Page 1 became page 2. Paragraphs became clauses. Clauses became subsections. Every sentence arrived with the same steady confidence. The laughter disappeared completely. Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle over the room. Awe, because the impossible was beginning to look real. And as Nia continued reciting language that should have been forgotten, the people around the table slowly realized they were witnessing something far more valuable than a billion-dollar merger. They were witnessing a mind unlike any they had ever encountered. The room no longer felt like a conference ballroom. It felt like a courtroom where reality itself was being tested. Nia Richardson continued speaking while attorneys worked furiously to verify every line she recited. Laptops glowed across the conference table. Legal advisors compared notes. Assistants searched archive drafts. Each time they checked her words against available records, they found the same result. She was correct. Again, and again, and again. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to disbelief. Nobody was smiling anymore. Nobody was whispering jokes. The executives who had laughed only minutes earlier now leaned forward in complete concentration. Nia stood beside the conference table with remarkable composure. Her voice never rushed. She never paused to search for words. Complex legal terminology flowed with the same ease as everyday conversation. Ownership provisions, liability limitations, arbitration procedures, financial obligations, dates, percentages, definitions. Every detail emerged with astonishing precision. Ethan Montgomery felt the confidence he normally carried beginning to disappear. Throughout his career, he had sat across from elite attorneys, brilliant negotiators, and respected industry experts. He had never witnessed anything remotely similar to this. The merger itself had become secondary. The true focus of the evening now stood beside a coffee service station calmly reconstructing a missing 20-page contract from memory. One attorney suddenly raised his hand. "Stop there." The interruption caused several people to look up. Nia fell silent. The attorney adjusted his glasses and stared at his screen. The wording in subsection 22. He looked confused. That cannot be right. A few executives exchanged glances. For the first time in nearly 20 minutes, uncertainty entered the room. Ethan felt a strange sense of relief. Perhaps they had finally found a mistake. The attorney continued reviewing the language. Then his eyes widened. Wait! He checked another file. Then another. The room remained silent. Finally, he looked up. She is right. The words landed heavily. The backup version contains an editing error. Her wording matches the final revision exactly. Several people stared at Nia in complete astonishment. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. He realized something remarkable. Nia was not simply remembering the contract. In certain places, she appeared to understand it better than the professionals reviewing it. The realization spread through the ballroom. People began looking at her differently. Not as someone with an unusual memory, as someone with exceptional intelligence. The distinction mattered. Near the far end of the table, a senior legal consultant who had remained quiet most of the evening suddenly spoke. "I have seen this before." Heads turned toward him. The consultant was in his late 60s and had spent decades working with universities and research institutions. He continued studying Nia carefully. "Not often," he added. "But I have seen it." Ethan looked toward him. "Seen what?" The consultant folded his hands together. "Highly superior autobiographical memory, extreme retention ability, rare cognitive profiles that allow certain individuals to store and retrieve information with extraordinary accuracy." The room fell silent again. The explanation sounded almost unreal, yet it fit everything they had witnessed. Nia looked slightly uncomfortable hearing herself discussed that way. She lowered her eyes and offered a small smile. The consultant continued. "People like this are extraordinarily rare." Ethan stared at Nia. For hours she had moved through the room unnoticed. Invisible. Ordinary. Easy to overlook. Yet she possessed a gift that none of the executives, attorneys, or advisors around the table could match. And for the first time that night, Ethan began wondering not what Nia Richardson remembered, But how many opportunities the world had missed simply because nobody had taken the time to ask who she was. The realization spread across the ballroom slowly at first, then all at once. What had begun as a delayed merger meeting had transformed into something nobody present would ever forget. Attorneys stopped debating. Executives stopped checking their phones. Financial advisors abandoned spreadsheets and projections. The attention of an entire room now rested on Nia Richardson. The missing contract no longer seemed like the most remarkable thing that had happened that night. The remarkable thing was standing beside the conference table in a service uniform. Nia remained exactly as she had been all evening, calm, polite, unassuming. The difference was not in her. The difference was in how everyone else looked at her. Ethan Montgomery noticed it immediately. Earlier, people had barely acknowledged her presence. Now every conversation seemed to revolve around her. Questions began arriving from every direction. One executive wanted to know where she went to college. Another asked whether she had ever worked in law. A third wondered if she had participated in memory competitions. Nia answered each question with the same modest honesty. Yes, she attended college. No, she had never practiced law professionally. No, she had never entered memory competitions. The answers only deepened the mystery. Near the far end of the conference table, the senior legal consultant continued studying her carefully. Then something seemed to occur to him. He reached for his phone and began searching through old files. Several minutes passed. The room resumed quieter conversations while attorneys continued reconstructing the contract from Nia's recitation. Suddenly, the consultant sat upright. His eyes widened. I knew I had seen that name before. The comment immediately captured attention. Ethan turned toward him. What are you talking about? The consultant rotated his phone toward the group. An old academic article filled the screen. The publication came from nearly a decade earlier. The title referenced exceptional memory retention and advanced cognitive recall. Beneath the headline appeared a photograph of a young college student. Nia. The room went completely silent. Several people stood and moved closer to see the screen. The consultant adjusted his glasses. This study was conducted through a university research program. He scrolled through the article. A small group of participants demonstrated extraordinary recall abilities. Most performed well above average. One participant produced results that researchers described as statistically exceptional. He looked directly at Nia. That participant was you. A wave of astonishment swept through the ballroom. Nia looked slightly embarrassed by the attention. That was a long time ago, she said quietly. But nobody seemed interested in minimizing it. The article detailed memory assessments, retention experiments, and academic evaluations. Researchers had tested hundreds of participants. Nia's results placed her among the strongest performers ever measured in the program. Ethan stared at the screen, then at Nia, then back at the screen. The pieces finally began fitting together. Her ability was not a lucky coincidence. It was real, documented, verified. Years before she ever stepped into the Grand Lexington Hotel, experts had already recognized something extraordinary about her mind. The revelation changed the room again. Respect replaced curiosity. People no longer wondered whether she was talented. They wondered how someone with gifts like hers had ended up serving coffee at corporate events. Ethan found himself asking the same question. Because the more he learned about Nia Richardson, the harder it became to understand how someone so exceptional could remain hidden in plain sight for so long. The merger negotiations eventually resumed, but nobody approached them with the same mindset they had carried into the ballroom earlier that evening. The numbers remained important. The signatures still mattered. Yet something more significant had taken place. An entire room full of accomplished professionals had been forced to reconsider their assumptions. The missing contract was nearly reconstructed. Attorneys continued verifying clauses while legal assistants organized the information Nia Richardson had provided. With every passing minute, confidence grew that the agreement would be completed successfully. Yet the conversation no longer centered on the merger. It centered on Nia. Ethan Montgomery sat quietly reviewing the reconstructed draft. but his attention kept drifting toward the woman who had transformed the evening. Earlier, he had measured her by the uniform she wore. Now he found himself wondering about the choices she had made, the opportunities she had encountered, and the challenges she had faced. Eventually, he stood from his chair and walked across the ballroom. Several executives noticed immediately. The billionaire chief executive officer rarely approached people without a reason. Nia was organizing empty cups near a service station when Ethan stopped beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. The sounds of keyboards, printers, and quiet legal discussions filled the background. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Why are you working here?" The question sounded simpler than he intended. Nia looked up and smiled faintly. "I work here because it is my job." Ethan shook his head. "You know what I mean." Nia seemed to understand. She glanced toward the conference tables where attorneys continued reviewing documents worth billions of dollars. "Life does not always follow the plans people make for it," she said. Ethan listened carefully. There was no bitterness in her voice. No resentment. Only honesty. "After college, my mother became ill," she continued. "Then other responsibilities came along. One year became another. Opportunities changed. Priorities changed." Ethan nodded slowly. The explanation felt familiar in an unexpected way. He had spent years believing success resulted entirely from talent and determination. Tonight reminded him that circumstances played a role as well. Some people received opportunities at exactly the right moment. Others sacrificed those opportunities for reasons nobody else ever saw. Nearby, several executives continued discussing Nia's remarkable memory. Others searched online for the university study connected to her name. The more information they discovered, the more impressed they became. Yet Nia appeared almost uninterested in her own reputation. She spoke about the research study the way someone might discuss an old-school project. She treated extraordinary accomplishments as ordinary facts. Ethan found that humility impossible to ignore. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the lead attorney finally stood and announced that the reconstructed contract matched the available records with extraordinary accuracy. The merger could proceed. Relief spread throughout the ballroom. Smiles returned. Conversations resumed. Yet the applause that followed was not for the attorneys. It was not for the executives. It was not even for the merger itself. Every person in the room looked toward Nia. The recognition arrived naturally, earned completely through ability, character, and grace. Ethan joined the applause, not because others were doing it, because he meant it. And as he watched Nia Richardson accept the appreciation with quiet dignity, he realized something that years of board meetings and business victories had never taught him. The most impressive person in the room is not always the one sitting at the head of the table. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the merger was finally complete. Signatures covered the reconstructed agreement. Attorneys exchanged relieved handshakes. Executives closed laptops that had remained open for hours. The crisis that threatened to derail one of the largest business deals of the year had been resolved. Yet as people began gathering their belongings and preparing to leave, it became clear that the contract itself was not what they would remember. Years later, very few would recall the exact financial terms of the agreement. Almost none would remember the percentages, clauses, or legal provisions that had consumed the evening. What they would remember was Nia Richardson. The ballroom slowly emptied. The skyline outside the windows had begun to soften as the first hints of dawn approached the horizon. Chicago remained awake beneath the fading darkness. Inside the Grand Lexington Hotel, conversations still circled around the same extraordinary story. Attorneys spoke about the accuracy of Nia's recall. Executives discussed the university research study. Several people admitted they had never witnessed anything comparable in their careers. Through it all, Nia continued helping the hotel staff clear tables and organize equipment. The attention had not changed her. Ethan Montgomery watched from across the room. The contrast struck him deeply. Most people would have spent the rest of the night accepting praise. Most people would have enjoyed becoming the center of attention. Nia seemed far more interested in finishing her shift. Eventually, Ethan walked toward her once more. This time there was no audience. No negotiation. No crisis. Just two people standing in a nearly empty ballroom. For a moment he looked around the room where the evening had begun. He remembered his first impression of her. A waitress carrying coffee. Someone he believed could not possibly understand a complex contract. The memory made him shake his head. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly. Nia smiled. "You already apologized." Ethan nodded. "Maybe, but I learned something tonight." She waited patiently. Ethan glanced toward the conference table where billion-dollar decisions had been made only hours earlier. "I spent years believing the smartest person in the room would always be easy to identify." Nia laughed softly. "That seems like a risky assumption." Ethan smiled for the first time. Apparently it was. The two stood in comfortable silence. Nearby, hotel employees finished cleaning while the final guests departed. The extraordinary night was ending exactly where it began. Yet everything felt different. Ethan extended his hand. Nia shook it. Not as a waitress and a billionaire. Not as staff and executive. Simply as two people who now understood each other better than before. As dawn approached, Nia collected her belongings and prepared to leave. She walked toward the ballroom exit with the same quiet confidence she had carried all evening. No dramatic farewell. No speech. No celebration. Just dignity. Ethan watched her disappear through the doorway and realized the most important lesson of the night had never been written anywhere inside the contract they worked so hard to recover. It was written in the assumptions people make every day. The room had judged Nia by a uniform. Reality revealed something far greater. Talent does not announce itself. Intelligence does not always sit at the head of the table. And human potential is often hidden where nobody thinks to look. The contract was 20 pages long. The lesson was only one sentence. Never confuse someone's position with their worth.